Ladies and gentlemen, one of the foremost experts on President Ronald Reagan, a historian, a friend of mine by the name of Craig Shirley, has a wonderful new book out called Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan. Craig Shirley, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, Mark. How are you? And John Highbush says hello.
Well, good. He's a very, very dear friend of mine, and for the rest of the country, he is the man that runs the Reagan Library and Foundation.
Yes.
Now, you have written how many books on Reagan now?
I've written 4. This is my 3rd that's been published. My next comes out next year, which is called Becoming Reagan, which is about a period in time which is...
I want to focus on this one.
Okay. All right, okay.
All right. Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan. Okay, the title kind of speaks for itself. Tell us about the final years of Ronald Reagan.
Well, first of all, the way the book came about was my youngest son was all of our books have been family projects and doing fact checking and research and Zurine edits and things like that. And about 3-4 years ago, my youngest son Mitchell was highlighting these big binders of old newspaper clippings, highlighting every time he read the name Reagan. And he looked up and said, "Dad, has anybody ever done a book about Ronald Reagan after he was president?" And I thought for a second. I said no. So that was the birth of Last Act. Last Act disputes the myth that Reagan, the shorthand, history is that he went back to California, announced he had Alzheimer's, and passed away. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of living and there was a lot of action in those 16
Can I just
years.
Stop you right there?
Sure.
Real quick, just so the audience knows, because I visited Ronald Reagan in 1990 and with my family in his office.
Right.
And he was very cogent. He was very thoughtful. He was very friendly. He was joking around. We talked a little bit. Is that is that what you saw and heard too?
That's exactly the Ronald Reagan that is in Last Act. He went to Mayo Clinic every year for testing, for physiological and psychological and physical testing, and every year he passed the mental and the psychological testings with flying colors. Sequence and numbers and things like that. It was only until 1994, 6 years after leaving office, that he showed the beginnings of what was later diagnosed as Alzheimer's. But before that, he showed no signs whatsoever. He was always engaged, always bright, always witty, always, he chaired hundreds of meetings in the National Security Council and other cabinet agencies and other secret meetings and things like that. He was a very hands-on president. As we've now come to understand, he was not just a 9-to-5 president.
And there are people alive today who worked very, very closely with the president in his last years and after he left office, like my former boss and mentor, Attorney General Edwin Meese, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And Ed is, I've been talking with Ed for the last couple of days, and he says that Ronald Reagan was as bright and engaged on the day he left office in January of 1989 as he was the day he entered office in January of 1981.
All right, well, we're not going to get into anybody else's books or anything because they'll accuse me of personally attacking them, and I'm really not interested in that. What is really, if you had to get across to my audience, the 2 or 3 most important things about Ronald Reagan in your book, what would it be? What would they be?
Well, first, A is that he always raised passions on both the left and the right, Mark. And what comes through in this book, because it deals with the 16 years, but it also centers on the week of the Reagan funeral, how much the American left loathed Ronald Reagan and how much and how vicious they were, even the week of his funeral. Liberal columnists, college professors, virtually everybody from the left. Just as an example, New York City, the city of New York, closed its offices for the deaths of Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Lyndon Johnson, and Robert F. Kennedy, right? The New York City offices did not close for the death of Ronald Reagan. Now, I mean, there's no other reason other than just liberal bias. That and in 1,000 other ways, the left exhibited its contempt and despise, hatred of Ronald Reagan.
And also, he was very involved in his last days in terms of wanting to make sure that his papers were protected, that history was protected, What did he do in that regard?
Well, I mean, is that he was right up until the end. You know, he was given a series of speeches in Washington and around the country on the "quote-unquote" Iron Triangle, going after the K Street, Capitol Hill, and the media. What he called the Iron Triangle of that, stopped legislation, that stopped initiatives. I mean, it's kind of the history repeats itself because the Iron Triangle is still there in the form of the establishment. He didn't call it the establishment, but he did call it the Iron Triangle, and went after them very, very hard in a series of speeches written for him by Clark Judge that he worked on himself, of course. But the Iron Triangle was very much, he was always anti-establishment, always challenging conventional wisdom, and he was very much, he was never a big fan of giant corporations. He was always suspicious of all concentrations of power.
Mm-hmm. What do you think he would make of the Obama presidency today?
Well, at one level, he would be proud of the pluralism of America, and I think we all are. At another level, he would absolutely oppose. I mean, let's face it, Barack Obama and Ronald Reagan are polar opposites when it comes to their view of government and their view of the world. Reagan believed in the individual, the primacy and independence and dignity and personal privacy of the individual. He was very infused that way. Obama believes in the state. He believes in the superiority of the state over the individual, and the state must make decisions for the individual. And so, in that way, they are polar opposites. So in that regard, he would, on issue after issue after issue, Reagan was trying to take power away from Washington, send it back to the states and localities where the founders and the framers had intended it. And of course, Obama's doing just the opposite, seizing power and authority from the individual in the states to acquire it for the national government.
And in his latter days as president of the United States, what did he want to accomplish near the end of his presidency before he left office?
Well, he was very much. I mean, he never used the word legacy. He told Lou Cannon that. He said, if I do my job right, the American people decide what type of president I was. And of course, I mean, that's very American. It's very George Washington. It's very Cincinnatus. Lay down your sword, go home, and let the people decide what type of president or leader you were. So he's very much infused with the founders and the framers, especially Washington and several others. As a matter of fact, he studied Washington's farewell address before he wrote his own farewell address. But obviously, he had three big things in mind, and he said so in his farewell address, was that the restoration of American morale, of which he was successful, the restoration of the American economy, of which he was successful, and the eventual defeat of the Soviet Union, again, which he was successful. And that's the way, really, presidents should be measured, is that what were the problems confronting them when they took office, and did those problems exist when he left office? Reagan was confronted in 1980 when he was elected with a failing economy, losing the Cold War, and the downfall of the American morale. And all three things he turned around within 8 years.
Secret Service agent Jerry Parr died the other day.
Yeah, God rest his soul.
A remarkable man.
Changed the world.
You changed the world. Your recollection of those events?
Well, Jerry Parr was the agent in charge of the detail, and was with Reagan. Had been on other presidential details, but he had a special fondness for Reagan, as did all the other Secret Service agents. Unlike, say, Bill and Hillary, whom it's leaked out that they've never liked being on their details. But Reagan is shot. He is shoved in the back seat. The limousine is headed for the White House. Now, Reagan's laying on the floorboards, and Parr is laying on top of him, and he's a big, heavy man, and Reagan is, to the point of being angry. Get off, get off, get off. And he wakes, and he gets up, and he said, I think I broke a rib, and he starts coughing up blood. Parr sees that it's foamy blood, which means it's coming from the lungs, which means it's a serious, serious injury. So he makes the split decision right there. Don't go to the White House. Go to the George Washington Hospital. And in that decision, he saved Ronald Reagan's life.
Craig Shirley will be right back. The book is Last Act. And I'm Mark Levin. Now, folks,
Are you or someone